Hey, welcome back to Another Look. I'm so glad that you chose to join me today. Remember that all we're doing in this is just kind of a midweek check-in, right? We're in the middle of this big project called the Gospel Project, where we're looking at the life of Christ sequentially. And each week, we're just kind of having a midweek check-in where we'll talk about something we talked about on Sunday, or maybe we'll bring up a different angle on it or a different way of thinking about it. And we're kind of in an interesting time with it because we're in the stuff that we would usually look at around Christmas. And I don't know about you, but as we've been doing this, and this last week we talked about the wise men coming, as we've been doing this, I kind of will study it, or I'll look at it, or when I gave the sermon on Sunday, I'll go outside, I'll kind of expect it to be cold because it's usually Christmas time that we're looking at this stuff. But I want to take a little bit of a different slant today. This week we were in Matthew chapter 2 when the wise men or the magi come to visit Jesus. And, there's so much in that story, and there's so much that you can pull apart. But one of the things that I want you to think about is the places. Places play an incredibly important part in the Christmas story, whether it's Jerusalem itself, it's Bethlehem, or it's Egypt. And specifically what I want to talk about today is Egypt. But let's just remember the big sort of obvious story in case you weren't with us on Sunday, or just to remember it again, even if you were with us on Sunday. As we get to Matthew chapter 2, again, remember, Jesus is probably about 2 years old when the wise men come. They weren't there at the birth. It was several years later. We learned that from Herod wanting to kill the kids who were under 2. And evidently the family had settled, at least temporarily, in Bethlehem. And so they're all settled in Bethlehem. Jesus is about 2, right? They've lived through those first 2 years of Jesus' life. And then it's kind of something weird happens, or I guess probably better put, another weird thing happens. These magi, or these wise men from the east, show up. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about them today, but they bring these gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh, these incredibly important gifts that were fit for a king. They're not the normal sort of shower gifts that they would have brought to kids in these times. These were gifts that were fit for a king, and they were really, really expensive gifts. And remember that these wise men, or magi, they were very important people. We have this image, I think, mainly from our manger scenes of, these 3 guys. We don't even know there were 3 of them. They just brought 3 gifts. But these 3 guys kind of on their donkeys, or maybe they're on a camel, and they come and they're in nice robes and they're bearing gifts. But, if you read some of the history around these guys, you realize that these aren't the cute little wise men from our manger scenes. In fact, they probably came, several historians say they probably came with a caravan of around 300 people. And that 300 people included servants. They probably had a military escort. There were all sorts of supplies and all of that stuff. And this caravan, I want you just to have this picture for a minute, if you would. This caravan of 300 people, right, comes into this kind of quiet little town. Bethlehem was a town of about 1,000. So this caravan of 300 people comes into this quiet little town of 1,000 people. You can imagine kind of the uproar that probably caused. And we're not told a whole lot about what they do. They just come, says they worshiped by offering him these gifts, and then they left. And as they left, remember, they were warned that not to go back to Herod. They were warned to go home by a different route so that they would avoid Herod. Herod was horrible. He was largely crazy at this point. He had physical ailments. He had mental ailments. He had killed his wives. He'd killed his children because he thought they threatened his throne. Herod was a horrible, horrible guy. And so an angel warns the Magi, don't go back to Herod, go home by a different route. And then it warns Mary, it warns Joseph. It warns Joseph to go to Egypt because Herod knows that this king has been born to the Jewish people, and he's going to try to kill him. And so Herod knows the time of the star. He knows the place is Bethlehem. And what he does is he orders that all children 2 and under would be killed so that he'd make sure he got them. This is just a horrible, horrible guy. And so an angel warns Joseph, go to Egypt in order to avoid the children being killed. Now, Egypt is kind of a shocking place to order Joseph to go because really it's relatively far away in the time. It was probably about 75 miles. And remember, they have to do that on foot or maybe a donkey, but it's largely walking. And I don't know about you, but can you imagine traveling 75 miles with a 2-year-old on foot, or maybe you've got a donkey with you? But I mean, that's not an easy journey. And so this is not an easy journey to go to Egypt. And then you factor in that Egypt isn't a super nice place. Now, I will say that there were a lot of Jewish people living in Egypt. So they would have had an opportunity in Egypt to link up with a Jewish community. It's not like they went into Egypt with just nobody there. There were Jewish communities, and remember, the Jewish communities were great at taking in travelers and taking Jewish people who came and making them part of the community and part of the family. Jewish hospitality was a profoundly powerful thing that they did, and that they did very, very well. So going to Egypt, they would have been able to link up with a Jewish community there. But frankly, Egypt had a reputation. And it's kind of interesting that Egypt is mentioned about 569 times in the Bible. It's actually the only place, along with Jerusalem, that's in almost every book. Now, it's not in quite every book, but it's in almost every book of the Bible. So Egypt is all over the Bible. And so when we ask the question, why Egypt? One of the obvious answers is prophecy. We have Hosea 11:1 that prophesies that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. But remember, that's kind of putting, that's like asking the chicken and the egg question. Because remember that God inspired Hosea to write that, knowing that he would send Mary and Joseph to Egypt. So it's not like God thought, oh, I've got to fulfill that prophecy, I better send them to Egypt. God wrote the prophecy because he was going to send them to Egypt. So why Egypt? One author, a guy named Shanklin, said this. He said, Egypt is forever to be locked in Scripture as a place. Now listen to this. Egypt is forever to be locked in Scripture as a place of bondage, oppression, pride, arrogance, idolatry, and sinfulness. In other words, almost every time Egypt is brought up in Scripture, it's brought up either literally, practically, or it's brought up symbolically as a place of bondage, oppression, pride, arrogance, idolatry, and sinfulness. Why would God send the Messiah into that? Now, when you stop and you think about it, it's because that's exactly where God sent the Messiah. Was into a place of bondage, oppression, arrogance, idolatry, sinfulness. God sends Mary, Joseph, and Jesus to Egypt because it's a place of oppression, because it's a place of bondage, because it's a place of slavery. That's why Jesus came at all. And so often when we're studying this stuff, it's Christmas time, and I usually think of the song, O Come, Emmanuel, when I'm looking at the wise men. I don't know why. It's just there's some trigger there that triggers that song, O Come, Emmanuel. And there's a repeated line in that. And the repeated line is, shall come to you. Shall come to you. And really, that's the why of Egypt, because this having Jesus go to Egypt and come out of Egypt is this incredibly powerful image to people who understood the imagery of Egypt. It's this incredibly powerful image of Jesus coming to us in the midst of our fallenness, in the midst of our sinfulness and our tiredness and our overwhelmedness and our anxiety, in the midst, if I can put it this way for today, in the midst of our mess. Jesus wants to come into the midst of our mess. And so he shows us that right out of the gate by sending him to a place that symbolizes the mess. That's the why of Egypt. Thank you so much for joining me today. Appreciate you being with me, and we will be back and do this again next week.